Hey everybody, Mark here, reliving the American Revolution. And since we were talking about the Continental Navy, I thought we would talk about the father of the Continental Navy, or as some people like to say, the father of the United States Navy. And his name is John Paul. Now, you may think of him as John Paul Jones, and we're going to get to that. But he was of Scottish descent. He was born John Paul. He started going to sea when he was about 17 years of age. Loved going to sea. Was very smart, navigating stuff like that. And at the age of 25, both the captain and the second mate died of yellow fever, and he became in charge of the ship. Returned it safely to port, and as a reward, the owners of the ship made him a captain, and he was then a merchant captain. And just as a side note, I am a licensed United States Coast Guard merchant captain, so I could feel for what he had to do. But so he had several ships, most of them merchant ships at the time. This is prior to the Revolutionary War breaking out. And he would run down to the East Indies, and he'd run to Nassau and the Bahamas and stuff like that, back and forth between England and all over. His crews never seemed to really like him. They were always talking about mutinies and stuff like that. And so he had one crew member that was mutinous and got caught. And so he whipped him, and he whipped him very, very bad. And the guy's family was very influential, so they pressed a lot of politicians to arrest him, and which they did. He was out on bail, and he ended up picking up another ship while he was on bail. And on that ship, he sailed down to Nassau, Bahamas, and he killed a guy with a sword. Now, John Paul claims it was in self-defense. However, about the same time, his brother, who lives in North Carolina, the colony of North Carolina, dies, and he has a plantation there. So John Paul sneaks out of the Bahamas and goes to North Carolina, and he ends up on this plantation, and he gets yellow fever. They take him to a family, because he has no one, takes him to this family of a friend, and their last name is Jones. And it is at this point that he's encouraged to maybe kind of hide out and not go back to England. So he adds the name Jones. Hence, we now have John Paul Jones. And so John Paul Jones, shortly afterwards, it's 1775, he goes to the Continental Congress, says, hey, I'm a great skipper, and you should give me a ship. And so they do. They give him a series of ships that he commands, and he does, runs up and down the East Coast, and he gets into some battles, and he's pretty active. He gets sent with his ship, the Ranger, over to France, and he operates out of France. And he's attacking the east coast of England, and he attacks the west coast, and he attacks Ireland. He gets into these battles and stuff like that. But he is most famous for his one of his last battles, and he becomes the recipient of a ship from France, and he names the ship the Bonhomme Richard in honor of Ben Franklin. And Ben Franklin wrote a book called the Farmer's Almanac, and Poor Richard's Farmer's Almanac. And so Jones, because he is friends with Franklin, names the ship the Bonhomme Richard. Now, it's not a very big ship, but it's pretty active. And so he gets into this battle off of Flambeau or Flamborough, some people say Head, which is in England, and he comes up against the Serapis. Now, the Serapis is a British ship, much bigger, excuse me, has a lot more guns, than the Bonhomme Richard, and they get into this battle. And so it's September 23rd, and it's about 6 o'clock at night, and they start doing battle back and forth, and uh, Jones realizes that he's really getting beaten, so he brings the Bonhomme Richard right up alongside the Serapis, and he has his Fleet Marines guys up in the rigging. We talked about them the last session, what the Marines were as opposed to the Army. They're up and they're sharpshooters and they're shooting at the British guys on deck. He finally gets some grappling lines over to the Serapis, and they pull the two ships together. And that's when the captain of the Serapis says to John Paul Jones, he says, "Do you give up?" And John Paul Jones so eloquently yells back, "I have not yet begun to fight." And he sends his famous words. And he sends his men over the rail, and they take over the Serapis. The captain of the Serapis realizes that it's a useless cause, and he surrenders. Now he surrenders to John Paul Jones on his own ship. John Paul Jones he dismisses the crews and stuff to other ships that are in the area, and he tries to save the Bonhomme Richard. And after a day and a half, they finally cut it loose, and it sinks. And then he has command of the Serapis, and he takes that back to France. And so we'll talk about the search for that. So he goes back to France. He resigns from the American Navy, and after a little bit, he joins the Russian Navy, where he is promoted to admiral. He then retires from the Russian Navy and moves back to Paris, where he lives until 1792 and dies. He's entombed. The French love this guy. He's entombed, and he's brought back to the United States in 1906, and they found his tomb, and they brought the tomb and everything back in 1906, and it is in the center of the United States Naval Academy's main hall, which is ironically called Bancroft Hall, after one of my relatives who was a very famous historian. And so John Paul Jones, whose real name is John Paul, is buried in Bancroft Hall at the United States Naval Academy. Now, when I lived in Mystic, Connecticut, one of my neighbors, her job was to locate the Bonhomme Richard. Everybody kept looking for it, couldn't find it, and she enlisted the help of the United States Navy, the French Navy, and this little group that she had, and she found the Bonhomme Richard. And it was funny because it took all these computers to regenerate all of the currents and the winds and all that stuff from 1779. And the divers found it, and they know that it's the Bonhomme Richard, and they have the location is obviously quite secret because they don't want people going and ripping stuff off of it, but it has French characteristics, which the Bonhomme Richard was not a British ship, was not an American ship, it was a French ship. So they were very ornate when they made their ships. So there you go, the story of John Paul Jones, whose real name was John Paul, and how he impacted the Continental Navy and the history of the United States Navy. Have a good one.